Today I've travelled up to Edinburgh and I'm at the Wake Up Call conference and I'm honoured to be joined by Lloyd Pye. Welcome, Lloyd.
Thank you.
And we've just finished watching you speak at the conference, and your talk was about the Starchild skull, and we will come on to that. But I'm very interested because I read your book, Everything You Know Is Wrong. I read that about 6 months ago. And that, I mean, it's very controversial, and it provides what you call interventionism, is it? Which is kind of halfway between the two accepted theories of we were created by God and we evolved from apes.
Right.
I guess it's kind of in between. But can you tell us, how did you get interested in anthropology? Because you're not an anthropologist.
Right.
How did you what led you to it?
Well, initially when I was a senior in high school, I read a book about basically Bigfoot, and I got interested in Bigfoot, which is a part of anthropology that's just not dealt with by the mainstream, but you know, they're creatures, and it's fair game for those of us who are willing to expand our minds and go for it. So I became a hominoid researcher, you know, Bigfoot, the abominable snowman. It turns out there are other kinds in the world that most people don't know about but are dominant in other continents. So collectively they're called hominoids, and that was my initial interest, was just that field of research.
Right. And then I guess you educated yourself on a more scientific level after that?
Well, the science, mainstream science doesn't teach those kinds of subjects. They do everything they can to keep those subjects out of curriculums anywhere. So you have to self-teach yourself. If you want to learn about hominoids, if you want to learn about the forbidden subjects, you just pretty much have to do it yourself.
And you do build a very good case for the fact that there are other hominoids or have been in the past. And you know, I recommend people read that book, Everything You Know Is Wrong, because there's a lot of references in there. Now, your argument is that there was an intervention sometime between 200 and 300,000 years ago, which sparked mankind.
Right.
And as far as I'm aware, there are three broad arguments for that view. The first is that the anthropological record doesn't suggest that we just evolved from apes. Could you expand on that for us, Lloyd, and explain why?
It's not the anthropological record that does that, it's the genetic record. Right. Anthropology says that we evolved from a common ancestor with chimps between 5 and 8 million years ago. Somewhere in there was a common ancestor, and humans and chimps branched into their separate species of today. That's what anthropology and zoology and all of that says. However, when geneticists in the middle 1980s rather began to look at mitochondrial DNA and clocking it backwards because they feel that it's something that can give them a timeline on humanity, when they did that, they found that we were about 200,000 years old, not between 8 and 5 million, only 200,000. So that's where our species begins as we are now, as we are today. So science then was in a real quandary because the anthropologists and the geneticists just did not agree on this timeline. So an answer had to be devised to explain away what the geneticists had found and still keep the idea of evolution intact. So what they came up with was what's called the bottleneck, the genetic bottleneck, in which they say sometime prior to 200,000 years ago, all of humankind up to that point in the world was decimated by some unknown kind of catastrophe, leaving only a few breeding pair alive, and those few breeding pair happened to be within reach of each other, so they could continue to have sex and procreate. So that's just, you know, it's an impossible scenario.
So if we draw a tree, branches of a tree, which is mankind sort of spreading its genes and spreading the race, it goes back to a point, and that point is between 200 and 300,000 years ago, and everyone agrees on that.
Right.
But what they don't agree on is whether that was the absolute start, or whether there was some other link to it's actually one branch off another larger branch.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And the argument is, did we in fact begin completely wholly at that point, or did we squeeze through that bottleneck, and prior to that we were something else, but we were very close to human, close enough to human, so that while all of them died out, all that were left were still pretty much the same thing.
Now, that said, you put forward the argument that at that point in time, when the start of that tree, that was the start, that there wasn't this link.
Right. I contend that at 200,000 years ago, we were we were the result of genetic engineering over the course of some particular length of time. I don't know, really can't say how much, but the end product of that genetic engineering is us. And they get the final product around 200,000 years ago, and it begins to spread from that point.
And I believe one of the lines of argument that you use to try and make that point is the fact that our genetic code has errors in it, which other species doesn't.
Right. Species can have genetic flaws, genetic defects. That's not an issue. They don't have nearly as many as we do. We have over 4,000 and counting genetic defects in our gene pool. So if we have a 200,000-year-old gene pool, how do you get 4,000 plus genetic defects? It's just implausible.
Now, when you use the word genetic defect, people will think, oh, someone with an extra finger or something like that.
No, I mean, by genetic defect, there are any number of genetic disorders. Down syndrome is a very common one. Spina bifida is one that everybody knows about.
Right.
Tay-Sachs disease. There's just lots of them.
Right.
And any one of those 4,000 can show up in any couple, because each of us carry about 200 of those 4,000 in our gene code. Now, in other words, not every person walks around with 4,000 genetic disorders. We walk around with about 200 each, but collectively in the gene pool itself, there are over 4,000. So it's a function of who you and your partner, when you have children, your 200 approximately disorders, and then whether or not any of your children are going to express any of those.
So what would that figure be in chimps, Lloyd? That
Oh,
equivalent
it would be considerably less. I mean, chimps, for example, gorillas, alligators. I mean, a lot of species have, for example, the genetic defect that causes albinism, causes albinos. So you can have albino chimps, albino gorillas, albino humans, albino alligators, albino birds, a lot of things, all right? So, but that doesn't kill you. That just makes you an albino. It doesn't kill you. So that passes on, you see. But with humans, there are a couple of dozen of our genetic defects that kill you early on, so before you reach puberty, so that you can't possibly have passed it on. So where do these come from, and then how do they get passed into the whole gene pool?
So it's suggesting that it's been messed with, basically.
There's that evidence, and then there's just the physical evidence of our genome showing very clearly that the second and third chromosome in humans that is in primates has been fused. I mean, genetically fused, so that its telomeres on its ends are cut off of the second and the third, and they've been put together in such a way that they still function. And that's extremely unlikely to have occurred naturally. Now, science says yes, it does, but really it doesn't.
Because human beings have 46 chromosomes, all other primates have 48. Am I right on that?
Well, the higher primates, yeah,
the higher
not the lower primates.
So if we've evolved from them, then at some point we would have dropped or fused those. So you would presume, if you go by the theory of this link, that was when the chromosome must have been dropped.
Exactly. When the two chromosomes were fused, it would be in the time leading up to the actual creation of human beings as we are today. Right. Yes.
Now, even if we accept the fact that we all came from this theoretical or actual Eve, which was, let's say it was 200,000 years ago, the anthropologists will say, well, yes, but the population went down to 1 or 2, but they actually evolved from apes. So therefore, if their theory is correct, there has to be an infinite number of, going by Darwinian evolution, an infinite number of adjustments from say 8 million years ago to now, through that, even down through that tree that we call it.
Exactly.
But you've looked at that, the evidence of bones, or either fossils or bones, to see whether the anthropological things that people dig up suggest that there is a linear path from, say, 8 million years ago to now.
Right.
What would you say on that?
Well, there is no linear path. There is no linear path anywhere in anthropology. Science tries to pretend that there is, but all you have to do is read a book called Icons of Evolution, and you find out how flawed and how much fraud is involved in that, the mainstream science. But as far as the human, pre-human fossil record, what is called the pre-human fossil record, you have two main groups. You have the Australopithecines, and then you have the early Homos. And the Australopithecines seem to lead into and overlap somewhat the early Homos at around 2 million years ago. Up to there, the Australopithecines are very ape-like looking. They have very, very ape-like heads. Then with the early Homos, it does have a more human-like head. The early Australopithecines have these big, wide cheekbones, and very different than what we have. So in the early Homos, the cheekbones are down. So there's a real transition point at about 2 million years ago. Something happens, and what existed before is modified into something, and very dramatically too. There's no gradualism, no Darwinism, any of that. And then suddenly you have Homos looking very different. But nonetheless, they are still very primate looking. They have big round night vision eyes. They have widely splayed noses that probably go, their nasal openings, noses flat across their face. They have mouths that stick off their face in the primate prognathous fashion. They have no chins. They have foreheads. They have big heavy brow ridges. They have foreheads that go back from those brow ridges. So they, in every way, for the next 2 million years, up to Cro-Magnons, you have that particular look with the brains growing bigger. So there's no evolution there. There's no change. It's dramatic overhauls, like overnight.
So there's no gradual set of skulls where the brow ridges gradually diminish to what we have.
That collectively science calls the missing link. And they just keep insisting that they're going to find the missing link someday, because it has to be there for their theory to be true. But in fact, there is no missing link. They haven't ever found one, and they're not going to find one. They keep saying they do, but they never do.
So this would be probably something about between 500,000 and 1 million years old, would you say? Let's just hypothesize that they're going to find it. That's the kind of age we're talking about.
Well, it would have to be somewhere between or around the transition from Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon, because it's so dramatic. Now, this is why Neanderthal is so important to science, because it's important for them to say in any way that they can that Neanderthals are very human-like. And so they spend a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to prove how human-like Neanderthals are, when in fact they're very little human-like, if human-like at all. They're really not. So I argue that in the end, Neanderthals are going to prove to be much more primate than human. Science needs them to be much more human than primate in order for evolution to look remotely like it's happening. So Neanderthals are kind of a swing vote here, although all you have to do is look at a Neanderthal physiologically and see that it really has no human bones in it at all. It's just Neanderthals are pre-human, yes, but they are primate much more than they are human. When Cro-Magnons appear, humans appear, and everything about them is different, everything compared to Neanderthals.
During 2011, I will be speaking at various venues throughout the UK: Newcastle-upon-Tyne, Telford, Weston-super-Mare, Leeds and Barnsley. Possible further venues to be arranged. Please check the upcoming events section on the richplanet.net website for more details.